The wind had a mind of its own that morning, low and mournful, scraping through the dry grass like it carried old names it wasn't done saying. The sky was a heavy gray, pressing down on the sandstone ridges until they looked bruised. A lone figure moved among the paddocks. Elias Rowe, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her fingers raw from the cold. She had been up before the light, breaking the thin ice on the water trough, her breath a ghost before her face. The land had turned against her, just as the seasons had, but she worked it still, out of loyalty, out of habit, out of some stubborn need to keep her father's name from blowing away like dust. The sound of hooves came slowly from the ridge. Not the rough, erratic clatter of a cowhand's pony, but something deeper, measured, deliberate. She straightened, heart ticking hard against her ribs. The sun hadn't yet burned through the clouds, and the rider appeared first as a dark shape, framed against the pale rise of the morning. When he drew closer, she saw the gleam of fine leather and the cut of a coat no working man could afford, Colt Abernathy. She'd heard the name before. Every rancher within 3 counties had. Some called him a businessman, others, a vulture who bought dying land cheap and rebuilt it into his empire. His horse was black as pitch, its bridle silver-tipped, and his face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He reined in by the fence, dismounting with a quiet authority that needed no words. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, the smell of earth and straw clinging to her. "Mrs. Wren," he said, his voice low but steady, like a man used to being obeyed. "I'm here on account of your father's debt." She didn't flinch, though her stomach twisted. "He's been gone 2 winters, she said. "I reckon the debt died with him." His gaze was steady, neither cruel nor kind. "Debts don't die easy. Not in these parts. The land is collateral, and the ledger's clear." He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and handed it to her. The writing was neat. Black ink pressed into old creases. Her father's name. Harland Wren. The amount beside it might as well have been a gallows. "I've nothing left to give," she murmured. "Not a horse, not a nickel. You can take the land if you must." Something flickered across his face then, a shadow of thought. "There's another way," he said after a moment. "You work off what's owed. My ranch needs steady hands, ones that don't talk much. A year's labor would cover it." Eliza looked past him to the horizon, where her mother's grave lay under a patch of wild sage. "You'd have me leave this place?" she asked. "You'd have a roof," he replied evenly. 3 meals, honest work. When the year's through, your debt's gone and you're free again. Free again." The words felt strange, like something she'd heard in a story. For a long time, she said nothing. The wind picked up, carrying grit into her hair. Finally, she nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I'll come," she said. He inclined his head. "Pack what you need. We ride within the hour." Inside the cabin, the silence pressed heavy. She moved through the rooms like through a memory, the smell of bread long gone cold, the creak of the old rocking chair her mother once sat in, the worn Bible on the mantel with pages gone yellow at the edges. She placed her father's pipe beside it, then folded her mother's shawl, the blue one with the hand-stitched edges, and laid it carefully on top. She took only the brown wool one for herself. Outside, Colt was checking his horse's cinch. She climbed onto her mare, a faded sorrel whose ribs showed under its coat. He said nothing, only turned his mount toward the trail. The road wound down through the valley where the snow hadn't yet melted. The hooves of their horses made soft, hollow sounds in the damp earth. Eliza kept her eyes on the distant hills, refusing to look back. Yet she could feel the cabin behind her, the ghosts of laughter, of her father's voice reading by lamplight, of a life that had ended before she'd realized it had begun. For a while, neither spoke. Then, near the ridge, she asked quietly, "Do you make a habit of collecting debts this way?" He glanced at her, then back to the trail. "No," he said. "Most don't take the offer. Why me then?" He paused, as if weighing how much truth to give. "Because you're still here," he said simply. "Most walk away before winter does it for them." They rode on. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. She studied his profile, the rigid jaw, the faint scar at the corner of his mouth, the way his gloved hand rested on the reins like he was holding back more than just the horse. There was a quiet fatigue about him, something not born of age but of burden. As the day wore on, the land stretched wide and endless before them. Open prairie fading into mist, a hawk circling high above. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured like a warning. By sundown, the ranch came into view. It was vast, fenced in with cedar posts, and crowned by a big white house that caught the last of the light. A lantern flickered in one window, but otherwise the place looked deserted, like it was waiting to breathe again. Colt dismounted first, tying his horse to the post. "You'll take the small house behind the main barn," he said. "It's warm enough if you keep the stove lit. We start work before dawn." Eliza slid off her horse, her legs stiff from the ride. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of pine smoke and horses. She gathered her shawl close, looking at the long porch, the empty chairs lined against the wall. He turned to go, then hesitated. "You'll find it quieter here than you're used to," he said. "Some folks don't talk unless there's reason to." "I don't mind quiet," she said softly. He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable in his gaze, then nodded and walked toward the house. The door closed behind him with a sound that seemed too final for a place so large. Eliza stood there, the wind tugging at her skirt, and looked out over the fields that now belonged to another man. The lanterns began to glow along the fence line, one by one, until the ranch lay under a hush of amber light. She exhaled slowly, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. This was not home, not yet, but it was where her story would keep breathing, at least for a while longer. And as she stepped toward the small house, her boots sinking into the soft earth, she thought she caught for just a heartbeat the sound of another breath, his carried on the wind. A man not cruel but tired, a man who, like her, had forgotten what mercy felt like until it came wearing another person's silence. The snow didn't stop, not really. It just grew quieter, softer, the way sorrow sometimes does when it's had its say. Days stretched long and gray over Dawson's Hollow, each one bleeding into the next. Smoke drifted from the chimney like a slow prayer, and within that cabin, two strangers learned how to live in the same silence. Clara moved through the place like someone afraid of breaking something that wasn't hers. She mended her skirt by the fire, her fingers raw from the cold, her stitches small and deliberate. When Eli stepped out to tend the stock, she'd drift to the window, watching him move across the yard, broad-shouldered, steady, his coat dark against the snow. He never hurried. Everything he did seemed shaped by patience, or maybe just weariness. The cabin bore traces of another life, what came before her arrival. A woman's life once. Clara noticed it in the small things. A shawl folded on a chair back, a row of jars along the shelf with bits of dried herbs inside, a braid of lavender hanging above the door. The air still held the faintest scent of it, even after all these winters. One afternoon, while Eli was mending the fence line, she found an old brass ring sitting on his workbench beside a pile of worn tools. It was a wedding band dulled by time. She touched it gently, the way one might touch a sleeping animal, and a feeling like guilt bloomed in her chest. When Eli came in, shaking the snow from his hat, he caught her looking. Their eyes met for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, almost absently, "You can keep to that chair by the stove. Floor stays cold till noon." And that was all. Still, something in his tone had softened. By the week's end, Clara began to help without asking. She carried in firewood, patched the draft under the door with burlap, scattered feed for the hens behind the barn. Eli didn't thank her, not once, but he stopped watching her like she might bolt. In the evenings, he'd sit by the window with his coffee, boots stretched toward the fire, and she'd take the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. The wind outside whistled through the chimney, and sometimes, if one of them shifted, the old boards sighed beneath their feet, like the house itself was remembering what warmth felt like. They didn't speak much. But now and then, a few words passed between them, small things that carried more weight than they seemed to. "How long's it been since anyone came through here?" she asked one night. 3 months, he said. "Trapper by the name of Wolf spent the night. Said the plains were bare of game this winter. Clara nodded, eyes on the fire. Maybe that's why folks go hungry. Chasing after what won't be caught. He looked at her then. Curious, but said nothing. Another night. While Eli worked on a saddle strap at the table, she asked quietly, "You ever lose something that don't stop hurting?" He didn't raise his head, just kept threading the needle through leather. "Every man who's lived long enough," he said. The words hung there, quiet and honest. Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to. The fire popped once, sending sparks into the dim. At night, her sleep was restless. Sometimes Eli would hear her murmuring through the thin dark, names he didn't know. Caldwell, Boone, Sheriff. He'd sit in his chair by the door, rifle across his knees, pretending not to hear, his eyes fixed on the dying coals. There was a weight in her voice when she spoke those names. Anger, fear, maybe regret. He didn't ask which. Some things a body has to keep unspoken just to breathe. By the second week, the storm had passed for good. The land lay still under a pale sun, the snow crusted like glass. Eli saddled his horse for the ride into town. He needed feed and coffee grounds, maybe a new file for the axe blade. Clara watched him from the porch as he mounted up, her arms wrapped around her shawl. "You'll be back before dark?" she asked, and he nodded once, the brim of his hat cutting a shadow across his face. The trail to town wound low through the hollow and across a frozen creek. When Eli reached the general store, the sound of men's talk filled the place. Low, mean laughter that didn't stop when he stepped inside. "Word is, there's a girl being hunted," one said. A tall ranch hand with red windburned cheeks shot young Boone Caldwell near the river. Sheriff's got riders scouring the flats. Eli didn't look up as he measured coffee into a sack. "You don't say, pretty thing," another added. "Fool too, thought she could hide up this way. Folks say she run off with money, or maybe she just didn't like what Boone asked of her." The laughter came again, ugly, careless. Eli's hand paused on the counter. He tied the sack shut, slow and neat, and said only, "World's full of stories." Then he paid and walked out without meeting a single man's eye. The ride back felt longer than it should have. The wind had changed direction, carrying a scent of pine and thawing earth, but his mind stayed cold. He saw her face again, the raw fear when she'd fallen into his arms, the way her eyes darted toward the sound of distant hoofbeats. It fit now, the shape of her silence. When he reached the cabin, dusk was creeping in. Smoke curled from the chimney. She'd kept the fire alive. Inside, she was kneeling by the stove, stirring a pot of stew that smelled of beans and salt pork. She looked up as he entered, the light catching the bruise still faintly visible near her hairline. "Town's quiet?" she asked. "For now," he said. He hung his coat, brushed snow from his hat. "Storm broke for good. Ground'll thaw soon." "That's good," she murmured, though she didn't sound sure. Eli sat, poured himself coffee, and let the warmth settle through his hands. The silence between them felt different now, not empty but heavy with understanding neither could quite speak. When she finally looked up from her bowl, her eyes met his. "You heard something," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Don't matter what I heard. You're here now. That's what matters." She blinked, swallowing hard, and turned back to the fire. The spoon trembled slightly in her hand. Outside, the wind stirred the snow from the eaves. Inside, the cabin glowed with a small, steady light, the kind that lingers in places long after the past has burned everything else away. The blizzard came down from the mountains without warning, rolling over the valley like a white wall of anger. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and the wind rose to a low moan that clawed at the cabin walls. Eli Cutter knew the sound. He'd heard it many winters before, back when the world still held a heartbeat he cared to listen for. Now it was only another reminder of how small a man could be beneath the sky's cruelty. He had just brought the cattle into the lower shed when the snow began to fall in earnest, hard, fast, unrelenting. By the time he pushed through the door again, his coat was sheathed in ice. Clara stood by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin mug, eyes following him like she was still learning what kind of man he was. "It's coming down heavy," he said. shutting the wind out with his shoulder. "We'll be snowed in by sundown." She nodded, quiet, her lips pale. "Then we're trapped?" He poured himself coffee and shrugged. "Safer inside than out. Let it bury us if it wants. Snow's got a way of keeping trouble away." Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the cabin filled with the scent of burning pine and boiling coffee, the air dense with warmth and the soft hiss of snow against the shutters. Hours passed like that. Eli mending a harness at the table, Clara darning the hem of her coat, neither speaking much. That night, the wind howled like wolves along the ridge. It crept under the door and made the fire gutter, casting their shadows tall and shivering on the walls. Clara sat near the hearth, knees drawn close, her face flushed with firelight. She spoke without looking up. "He wouldn't let me leave," she said suddenly, voice low, breaking the stillness like a dropped stone. "Said I owed him. Said he'd tell folks I let him on if I ran." Eli's hand stilled. The needle hung above the leather strap. "I went for his rifle when he came at me," she went on. "Didn't mean to. Didn't think. Just, he fell. And then I ran." Her breath shook. "They won't care what he did. His pa's got land, money, friends in every town from here to Laramie." The wind battered the roof, the timbers groaning under its weight. Eli set the strap down slowly, staring into the fire. His face gave nothing away, but his silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of a man thinking, remembering. "Sometimes," he said at last, "a thing done to survive still feels like dying." She glanced at him then, eyes glistening in the flicker. "You think I'm wicked? I think you're still breathing," he answered. "World don't give that easy." The fire popped. She didn't speak again for a long while. The storm grew worse, its cry rising like old ghosts calling through the pines. By the second night, the snow was piled high against the windows. The cabin walls groaned under its weight, the world outside erased beneath a blur of white. Eli kept the fire burning, his coat draped over Clara's shoulders when the chill bit through the floorboards. She tried to hide her trembling, but he noticed every time she brushed at her hair, every time her gaze flicked toward the door. Near midnight, a sudden pounding broke through the wind, 3 sharp knocks that rattled the boards. Clara flinched, the mug slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Eli rose slowly, rifle in hand, and went to the door. "Who's there?" A muffled voice came back, half lost to the storm. "Wolf, Jonah Wolf. Let me in, old man, before my blood turns to stone." Eli's shoulders eased. He unbarred the door and pulled it open. The wind burst in first, carrying snow and cold that bit the skin raw. Then came Wolf, tall, wrapped in furs, his dark hair heavy with ice. His face, half Lakota, half white, bore the hard calm of a man who'd lived too long between two worlds. He stomped the snow from his boots, nodded once to Clara, then clasped Eli's arm. "Didn't reckon to find company here," he said, his grin faint. "Storm's bad enough without sending her out to die," Eli answered. Wolf's eyes flicked toward Clara, then back to him. "Storm ain't the only thing coming down." He unshouldered his pack and sank near the fire. Men on the trail below the ridge, 4, maybe 5. Looked like bounty hands. Caldwell's got their loyalty bought in coin and whiskey. Clara went still. Her hand trembled on the blanket's edge. "They found me." "No," Eli said quietly. "They're looking. Snow will blind them, same as it blinds us. Let it hide us while it can." Wolf stared into the flames, his brow furrowing. "You know what happens when it melts, though." "Word don't stay buried." Eli didn't answer. He just poured Wolf coffee, handed it across the fire. The old trapper drank, his eyes sharp and searching. "You always did have a soft streak, Cutter." "Thought that died with Mara." Eli's gaze lifted, cold and steady. "Maybe it didn't." The room fell silent again, save for the wind and the hiss of sap burning in the logs. Clara sat small in the corner, the blanket pulled high, eyes darting between them. She looked like someone standing on a bridge that might not hold. After a while, Wolf spoke again, softer this time. "Ain't just snow out there tonight, Eli. It's judgment." Eli stirred the fire with the poker, watching the sparks rise and vanish. "Then let it fall," he said. "We'll see who it buries." Later, as the storm raged toward dawn, the three of them sat awake in uneasy quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, their faces lit by the same orange glow. The world beyond the walls was gone, swallowed whole by snow and wind, and yet inside that cabin something fragile began to form. A kind of peace that existed only when everything else had been stripped away. When the fire burned low, Clara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they come, you don't have to stand for me." Eli looked over at her, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I will." Outside, the storm howled on, furious, endless, and alive. But inside the cabin, the air had changed. The cold no longer reached them. The wind might batter the walls, but for the first time in years, Eli Cutter felt the warmth of something worth guarding. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind that pressed low on the earth and stilled even the breath of the cattle. A thin fog crawled through the hollows, soft and white as milk, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Eli had been up before dawn, stoking the fire, pouring black coffee into 2 tin cups. Wolf was outside checking the horses, and Clara stood by the window, watching the mist swallow the ridgeline. For a heartbeat, it felt like peace, the kind that makes you forget it can't last. Then came the sound, distant at first, then closer. Hoofbeats. Eli's hand went to the rifle by the door. Wolf came running in, snow clinging to his coat. 5 of them, he said, low and certain. Coming fast, Clara's breath caught. She knew before anyone spoke. The Caldwells had found her. The first shot broke the window, spraying glass across the floorboards. Clara fell back with a cry. Eli shoved her behind the hearth, voice sharp. "Stay down!" Wolf fired through the doorway, his musket roaring like thunder in the cold air. The fog turned to chaos. Horses screamed. Wood splintered. Eli moved through it like a man made of iron, every motion deliberate, deadly. He fired twice, once through the corral post, once toward the ridge. A figure toppled from his saddle and vanished into the snow. Clara crawled to Wolf, who was bleeding from the shoulder, his face pale but his eyes steady. "You need to run," he rasped. "Get her out." Eli shook his head. "Not leaving my land." Bullets thudded into the fence. Clara clutched Wolf's hand, tears freezing on her cheeks. "They'll kill you both for me." "Then we make it cost them," Eli said. He rose from cover and strode into the open yard. The wind caught his coat, snapping it like a banner. He aimed and fired, the old rifle cracking through the stillness. One man fell, another wheeled his horse and bolted. The last came charging, shotgun raised. But Wolf, half-conscious and gritting his teeth, fired from where he lay. The rider tumbled backward into the drift. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of snow melting on hot iron from the gun barrels. Clara stood shaking. The fog thinned, revealing the aftermath. 5 horses scattering, 3 men still as stones. Eli walked toward Wolf and dropped to his knees beside him. Blood soaked the snow beneath the man's shoulder, dark as wine. "Hold on," Eli said quietly. Wolf tried to laugh, but it came out like a cough. "Told you judgment was coming," he whispered. Eli pressed his palm to the wound, eyes fierce. "Then maybe it's past." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of gunpowder and pine. Clara came to them, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to Wolf's shoulder. "We'll stop the bleeding," she said, her voice breaking. "You'll see. You'll be fine." But Wolf only smiled faintly. "You both." "Keep riding," he murmured. "World don't end here." Eli met her eyes across the firelight. No words, just understanding. The kind forged in blood and loss. They carried Wolf inside, laid him near the hearth where the fire still glowed. Clara fetched water, tore what was left of her skirt for bandages. Outside the snow began again, light and soundless, covering the bodies, the footprints, the blood. Later, when the worst was done, Eli sat on the floor beside the dead embers, his rifle across his knees. Clara stood over the fire, the bounty notice trembling in her hand. She struck a match and watched the paper curl, blackening to ash. Her name disappeared, smoke rising into the rafters. "I never wanted anyone to die," she said softly. Eli didn't look up. "You didn't make this fight. They did. Clara turned to him then, the fire behind her throwing gold across her face. And you stayed. He lifted his gaze, tired but steady. Couldn't let them take what's mine to protect. Something in the way he said it, quiet, unashamed, rooted her where she stood. Outside, the snow kept falling, smoothing the earth, washing the world clean. Inside, the flames whispered low, and the line between mercy and love blurred into the same breath. By the time dawn rose again, the fog was gone, and the sky burned pale and clear over Dawson's Hollow. 3 graves stood by the fence line, marked with stones. Wolf slept fitfully near the fire, still breathing. Clara sat beside Eli on the steps, a blanket around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long while. There was nothing left to say, only the stillness that comes after survival, when you realize what it cost and what it gave back. Eli looked at her finally, the light catching the scar on his cheek. "You can ride north when he's strong enough," he said. She nodded, but her eyes said something else, something that neither of them dared yet name. For now, the storm had passed. But in the fire's slow heartbeat, in the hush between them, something new had taken root, fragile, burning, alive. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind that pressed low on the earth and stilled even the breath of the cattle. A thin fog crawled through the hollows, soft and white as milk, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Eli had been up before dawn, stoking the fire, pouring black coffee into 2 tin cups. Wolf was outside checking the horses, and Clara stood by the window, watching the mist swallow the ridgeline. For a heartbeat, it felt like peace, the kind that makes you forget it can't last. Then came the sound, distant at first, then closer. Hoofbeats. Eli's hand went to the rifle by the door. Wolf came running in, snow clinging to his coat. 5 of them, he said, low and certain. Coming fast, Clara's breath caught. She knew before anyone spoke. The Caldwells had found her. The first shot broke the window, spraying glass across the floorboards. Clara fell back with a cry. Eli shoved her behind the hearth, voice sharp. "Stay down!" Wolf fired through the doorway, his musket roaring like thunder in the cold air. The fog turned to chaos. Horses screamed. Wood splintered. Eli moved through it like a man made of iron, every motion deliberate, deadly. He fired twice, once through the corral post, once toward the ridge. A figure toppled from his saddle and vanished into the snow. Clara crawled to Wolf, who was bleeding from the shoulder, his face pale but his eyes steady. "You need to run," he rasped. "Get her out." Eli shook his head. "Not leaving my land." Bullets thudded into the fence. Clara clutched Wolf's hand, tears freezing on her cheeks. "They'll kill you both for me. Then we make it cost them," Eli said. He rose from cover and strode into the open yard. The wind caught his coat, snapping it like a banner. He aimed and fired, the old rifle cracking through the stillness. One man fell, another wheeled his horse and bolted. The last came charging, shotgun raised. But Wolf, half-conscious and gritting his teeth, fired from where he lay. The rider tumbled backward into the drift. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of snow melting on hot iron from the gun barrels. Clara stood shaking. The fog thinned, revealing the aftermath. 5 horses scattering, 3 men still as stones. Eli walked toward Wolf and dropped to his knees beside him. Blood soaked the snow beneath the man's shoulder, dark as wine. "Hold on," Eli said quietly. Wolf tried to laugh, but it came out like a cough. "Told you judgment was coming," he whispered. Eli pressed his palm to the wound, eyes fierce. "Then maybe it's past." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of gunpowder and pine. Clara came to them, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to Wolf's shoulder. "We'll stop the bleeding," she said, her voice breaking. "You'll see. You'll be fine." But Wolf only smiled faintly. "You both." "Keep riding," he murmured. "World don't end here." Eli met her eyes across the firelight. No words, just understanding. The kind forged in blood and loss. They carried Wolf inside, laid him near the hearth where the fire still glowed. Clara fetched water, tore what was left of her skirt for bandages. Outside the snow began again, light and soundless. Covering the bodies, the footprints, the blood. Later, when the worst was done, Eli sat on the floor beside the dead embers, his rifle across his knees. Clara stood over the fire, the bounty notice trembling in her hand. She struck a match and watched the paper curl, blackening to ash. Her name disappeared, smoke rising into the rafters. "I never wanted anyone to die," she said softly. Eli didn't look up. "You didn't make this fight." "They did." Clara turned to him then, the fire behind her throwing gold across her face. "And you stayed." He lifted his gaze, tired but steady. "Couldn't let them take what's mine to protect." Something in the way he said it, quiet, unashamed, rooted her where she stood. Outside, the snow kept falling, smoothing the earth, washing the world clean. Inside, the flames whispered low, and the line between mercy and love blurred into the same breath. By the time dawn rose again, the fog was gone, and the sky burned pale and clear over Dawson's Hollow. 3 graves stood by the fence line, marked with stones. Wolf slept fitfully near the fire, still breathing. Clara sat beside Eli on the steps, a blanket around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long while. There was nothing left to say, only the stillness that comes after survival, when you realize what it cost and what it gave back. Eli looked at her finally, the light catching the scar on his cheek. "You can ride north when he's strong enough," he said. She nodded, but her eyes said something else, something that neither of them dared yet name. For now, the storm had passed. But in the fire's slow heartbeat, in the hush between them, something new had taken root, fragile, burning, alive. The days that followed the gunfight bled into each other, marked only by light and the slow ache of healing. The snow melted in thin streams along the fence posts, carrying away the stains of what had been. Mara kept the cabin warm, her hands steady even when her breath faltered. She boiled water, changed bandages, spoke softly to the horses when the wind rose. Elias drifted in and out of fever, haunted by flashes of gunfire and the sound of her voice pulling him back each time. By the 5th day, the rumor had already reached town. A widower out on the plains had gunned down 2 men protecting a half-breed girl. It was a story made for judgment. The law would come. It always did. Mara knew this. Elias did too. But neither ran. There was nowhere left to run that wasn't tainted by fear. When the marshal came, the earth was still soft with thaw. 3 riders appeared over the ridge, the marshal, his deputy, and a man from the town who had seen too much and understood too little. They rode slow, cautious, eyes scanning the place like it was something already condemned. Mara stepped out first. No weapon, no coat, only her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Elias was inside, sitting by the hearth, pale but upright. The marshal, a man older than most laws, dismounted, boots crunching on the wet earth. "Elias Rowe," he called, voice low. "Heard you killed 2 men out here." Elias didn't answer. Mara stood between them. "They came to take me," she said. Her voice didn't waver. He did what any decent man would. The marshal studied her face marked by both heritage and hardship, her posture neither submissive nor proud, just steady. His eyes softened a little. "And what would you have me do about it?" She met his gaze. "Leave him be." For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then the marshal exhaled, slow, heavy. He looked past her to Elias, who had managed to stand, one hand braced against the doorframe. "This place has seen enough killing," the lawman said finally. He holstered his revolver. "Let the snow bury it." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and the 3 riders vanished back into the pale horizon. Elias sank into the chair by the fire, exhaustion folding him in half. "You shouldn't have spoken for me," he murmured. Mara knelt beside him. Then who would? He didn't have an answer. He just looked at her, at the woman who had stepped between death and him twice now, once with a rifle, once with nothing but her voice. Spring came slow that year. Like a memory the earth wasn't sure it wanted to recall. The valley bloomed in patches, wildflowers breaking through the thaw, soft green along the riverbank. Mara planted some near the grave on the hill, where Elias's wife slept beneath a stone marked Anna Rowe Beloved. She didn't ask permission. She just knelt there one afternoon, pressing her hands into the soil, whispering words of peace in the old tongue. Elias watched from a distance, his hat in his hands. He thought of how grief had built his world, and how quietly it was now being undone. He couldn't offer her marriage. The word itself felt too large, too final, too far from where they stood. But he could offer something smaller and truer. A place, a roof, the safety of shared silence. When he told her, she didn't smile. She just nodded once and said, "Then we'll build something that won't need walls to stand." The lion's bones were found weeks later, half buried near the creek, sun-bleached, clean. Mara touched them with reverence, like a spirit returned to rest. "He was only hungry," she said softly. Elias stood beside her, his arm in a sling. "Ain't we all?" By midsummer, the ranch was alive again. The horses fattened. The fences held. The nights grew warm enough to sleep with the windows open. Sometimes, when the wind came through the trees, Mara sang, low and wordless, the melody carrying into the hills. Elias would sit outside, pipe in hand, listening, not as a man hearing music, but as one remembering what it meant to belong to something living. One morning, as the sun broke gold over the ridge, he saddled 2 horses. "We've work up north," he said, but she saw the glint in his eyes. Not work, remembrance. They rode out together, past the barn, across the thawing fields, to the edge of the forest, where she had once stumbled from the trees covered in blood and dust. The same horse she'd ridden that day carried her now, its coat healed, its step sure. Elias rode beside her, his old rifle slung low, the scar on his shoulder pale against the dawn. They stopped where the grass met shadow. The world was quiet, save for the wind through the pines and the slow rhythm of breath between them. Mara looked toward the trees. "This is where it began," she whispered. Elias nodded. "And where it ends, if we let it." She turned her face toward him, the morning light soft against her skin. "No," she said. "Not ends, just changes." He smiled then, a small, broken thing, but real. Together they sat their horses in the gold wash of sunrise, the forest behind them, the open plain ahead. 2 souls bound by the long road between fear and faith, between loss and what follows. And when they rode home again, the world seemed wider than before, not because it had changed, but because they had.